Hello, everyone. I'm Tanya Rivero in for Elaine Quijano. Thank you for joining us. President Biden and the First Lady head to Florida Thursday to meet with family members of victims of the Champlain South Towers collapse. The collapse has left at least 16 people dead. Nearly 150 are missing. Rescue crews are working around the clock to comb through the rubble as they search for any signs of life. Back on Capitol Hill, senators have been celebrating a bipartisan compromise on infrastructure, but it may be premature as questions linger over how to pay for it. Meanwhile, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin is boosting Democrats' hopes for their own family-focused infrastructure bill. On Monday, Manchin expressed support for passing a bill through budget reconciliation. That process excludes any need for Republican votes if all Democrats are on board. He and top progressives in the party remain trillions of dollars apart on a price tag, however. On the other side of Capitol Hill, the House voted Wednesday to formalize Speaker Nancy Pelosi's January 6th Select Committee. The group will investigate the causes of the deadly Capitol riot after Senate Republicans blocked the creation of a bipartisan commission. Speaker Pelosi plans to appoint up to 8 members of the committee. Early this week, she signaled that one of them could be a Republican. Officers injured while responding to the attack were in attendance. Here's what U.S. Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn told CBS News about what it meant to be in the gallery during the vote.
It's symbolic. I think the vote outcome is more important, so appreciate it.
But first, President Biden is launching a federal response plan to help states tackle record heat and wildfires. It comes as the Pacific Northwest is boiling after days of triple-digit temperatures. At a meeting with governors from western states, the president tied the extreme weather events to global warming.
Well, with climate change driving the dangerous confluence of extreme heat and prolonged drought, we're seeing wildfires of greater intensity that move with more speed, and last well beyond the traditional months of the fire season. And that's a problem for all of us. Wildfires are not a partisan phenomenon. We need a coordinated, comprehensive response with all the federal government working in close cooperation to support you, the states. That's what this is about.
We are also learning that Donald Rumsfeld has died. The 88-year-old former Defense Secretary's passing at his home in New Mexico was confirmed in a statement from his family. He was in charge of the Pentagon when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and Iraq following the 9/11 attacks. He served as Defense Secretary under Presidents Gerald Ford and George W. Bush. For more, let's bring in Ed O'Keefe, Alayna Treene, and Courtney Subramanian. Ed is CBS News senior White House and political correspondent. Alayna is a congressional reporter for Axios who co-authors their Sneak Peek newsletter, and Courtney is a White House correspondent at USA Today. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Ed, let me start with you. Can you give me your thoughts on the passing of former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld? How did he change that office? And how did it change him?
Well, in fact, it's not only the Defense Secretary job that he held, but he also was White House Chief of Staff for Gerald Ford for about a year. And in many ways was seen as one of the first sort of modern chiefs of staff that established the sort of traditional West Wing staffing structure that we're familiar with today. So in many ways, not only a trailblazer at the Pentagon in that he got to serve there twice, first as the youngest defense secretary ever, and then later for George W. Bush as the oldest person ever to hold the job, but was also seen as an early adapter of the system that is used now in the West Wing, and was consulted the rest of his career by his successors in both parties, and seen as a model for how that office could be run. But then, of course, running the Pentagon as he did during the era of the threat of nuclear war, and then in the early days of the threat of 21st century terrorism, he certainly left his mark on the Defense Department, even if it was as controversial as it was, especially during that second tour. Remember, it was not only the 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but it was the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, and so much else associated with the Bush era war on terrorism, but he will go down in history as certainly one of the most influential men who ever worked in this town, and also a successful businessman at that.
That's right. He had, what, 2 decades in the private sector, correct?
That's right. That's right. Working on all sorts of business deals through the years, and that is sort of how he spent the time between serving the Ford administration and then later the Bush administration, and had briefly run for president in 1988 as well.
What a career. All right. And Courtney, I want to turn to you now. What is the White House offering in terms of immediate relief for states dealing with this historic heat that we're almost all experiencing right now?
Yeah, well, the president used his meeting today with a group of governors of Western states to highlight how the administration is tackling what's expected to be another destructive summer of wildfires. And the main focus was a pay increase for firefighters to at least $15 an hour. Firefighters tend to make anywhere between $11 and $14 an hour and rely on overtime and hazard pay to make ends meet. And that's something the president said was unacceptable. They also talked about making 10% bonuses available to firefighters on the front lines, making more federal firefighter positions permanent rather than seasonal, increasing satellite detection systems, and overall just better coordination of the administration's emergency resources in some of these regions that are at risk for fire outbreaks. The White House also pointed to the bipartisan infrastructure framework that was reached and $47 billion that has been earmarked for flood and wildfire resilience programs. We heard Biden talk today about how the U.S. needed to act fast, that this was about playing catch up. And that's certainly the case considering, wildfire season is due to begin July 24th. That's just around the corner. And a lot of these mitigation efforts, are unlikely to be in place by then.
Right. And Ed, the president emphasized the link between these increasingly dangerous wildfire seasons and climate change. Here's EPA Administrator Michael Regan defending climate provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure deal. Let's listen.
This is a historic investment. This is the largest investment in American history, both on water infrastructure, but we also see some strong movement on climate in this infrastructure bill as well. When we look at the supply chain for electric vehicles, when we look at charging stations that will be deployed all across this country, what I would say is a first critical step, but the president is holding tight to his vision, and the president is looking again at all of the suite of options that he has from a toolbox perspective to pursue the goals that he's laid out.
So, Ed, what kind of pressure is the White House facing from climate activists after details of this bipartisan deal became public?
Oh, big pressure. And that they wouldn't trot out the EPA administrator to defend what's in the bipartisan plan if they weren't facing the music from members of their own party as they are. He points out that it would be a pretty historic investment in mitigation efforts and others to address the climate change issue. But, there is concern among those on the left, everyone from Bernie Sanders to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ed Markey, and others who say that this deal doesn't have enough of that. And they're pushing, of course, to make sure that the Democratic-only reconciliation package does. But it is telling that in the days since the announcement of this bipartisan deal, it seems this White House has had to do more maintenance among members of its own party than with Republicans who still appear to be on board. And, I just remember what the president said last week at one point on the day that he announced this. He said, ultimately, he's of the belief that most, if not all, Democrats will be on board with these proposals because they understand that something is better than absolutely nothing. And while there may be an aggressive fight over what exactly to do and what will be in these two proposals if they pass, his answer was essentially, look, it's historic, it's being done, and we're going to fight hard to get them both passed. But again, they wouldn't have to be out there saying these things if they weren't facing pressure, which they have been from those on the left.
Sure, and this heat wave seems perfectly timed to make sure climate change stays, at the top of mind here. Alayna, let's talk about the scope of the reconciliation bill. Is there anything that was cut from the bipartisan infrastructure proposal that could still make it into this Democrats-only bill?
Yes, Tanya, there was a lot actually that is not in the bipartisan deal. The bipartisan deal that a group of 10 senators struck with the White House mainly looked at what they call the hard infrastructure parts of his plan, the roads, the bridges, highways, waterways, a lot of transportation, while his family plan would be more so wrapped into the reconciliation bill. And that, of course, would address the climate efforts and child care provisions that Biden had put forward, among other things. But I do agree with Ed on how tough this is to sell to people on the left. But I'd also argue, I mean, he's getting incoming from all different sides and all different factions of both parties. And it's going to be very difficult for this White House to get either bill, but also both of them through in such a divided Senate, a 50-50 Senate, as well as the House Democrats only have a 4-seat majority, and so there's going to be, I think, a lot of debate over the next few weeks. I think some people think that this infrastructure deal, at least the bipartisan one, will happen very quickly, that it'll get a floor vote very quickly and move forward. I argue that's not the case. I think that this is going to continue to be a huge issue throughout the summer and even into parts of the fall, and they have to decide how to reconcile, again, these different factions. You have people on the left, progressives, who want this to be as big and bold as possible. You have moderates on the left, particularly those who are in competitive races, who are worried about the size of a potential reconciliation bill. Bernie Sanders, who chairs the Budget Committee, says he wants something as big as $6 trillion. I don't think that a lot of moderates will be on board with that. And then, of course, you have Republicans. A lot of Republicans in the Senate, in particular, have aren't very much in support of course, the reconciliation bill, but even the bipartisan bill. And so I think it's really going to be a numbers game in the next few weeks as they continue to debate the details of these bills.
And Alayna, to your point, are we starting to see clearer lines on exactly what lawmakers are willing to give on and what they're not willing to give on, to the point that you do actually think that this bill is in real jeopardy, the bipartisan bill?
It could be. I think, we saw this over the weekend, and it was pretty astonishing. President Biden said, following the deal being made for the bipartisan bill, that he would link the two, that if there's going to be a bipartisan bill, there needs to be a broader reconciliation bill. He ended up walking those comments back, which is, again, pretty stunning from the White House to do that, because there was so much criticism from Republicans, particularly those who worked on the deal, over this sort of linkage. But it is something that House Democratic leaders and Senator Schumer as well, Leader Schumer, both want as well. They say that there needs to be a reconciliation bill if there's going to be a bipartisan bill. And a lot of people on the right are uneasy with that, but a lot of people on the left, particularly progressives, I spoke with Ro Khanna, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, all of them say we need to have a reconciliation bill if we're going to vote for this bipartisan bill. And so it's really going to be hard to get all different sides on board with that bill.
And Courtney, either one of these bills means, more big government stuff. A new Gallup poll shows 22% of Americans think the government is the biggest problem facing the country. That is up 6% from last month. So how do you square that with the public support we've also seen for the president's proposed government programs, which stand to change the role of government in people's lives?
Well, government has shown up in this poll pretty regularly since 2017 as a concern Americans see as the most important problem facing the country. So it's not that surprising that we see it topping the list again, especially since, concerns over the coronavirus pandemic have started to recede. More Americans are getting vaccinated. We're seeing restrictions eased across the country. So, I think the issue here is that Congress is inching along on a number of these legislative priorities, that you've noted, some of them that are broadly popular with Americans. That includes getting an infrastructure bill done. That includes some of the so-called human infrastructure provisions of Biden's proposal on, child care and education. federal paid leave. And so, what we've learned with the pandemic is that, the benefits of big government have provided some Americans with a lifeline, especially those who were affected by COVID. If Americans can point to, the direct benefits of these programs, they sometimes transcend partisan lines. I mean, that's something we saw with the COVID relief package passed earlier this year. Certainly didn't get any Republican support, but we did see polling showing that it was broadly popular across the country. And so we've seen a big hold on the Hill, with some of these legislative items. And I think the rise in the number of people listing government as a top issue is a reflection of less of a concern on COVID and more traditional concerns about gridlock and partisan dysfunction, and for Republicans, about government overreach and excessive spending. So, lawmakers are unwilling to find some common ground on a lot of these issues, and I think that's something that we traditionally see Americans frustrated with, before the pandemic took hold, and also something that the president vowed to try and tackle on the campaign trail. He talked about reaching across the aisle, and that's something we haven't seen. So, I think it makes sense that this would return to the top of the list.
And Ed, on Tuesday, the top U.S. general in Afghanistan expressed grave concern over the loss of territory to the Taliban. He said, quote, "A civil war is certainly a path that can be visualized if this continues on the trajectory that it's on right now. That should be of concern to the world." So, Ed, you asked White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki about General Miller's comments earlier. Here's what she said.
Was anything he said to reporters in the last day or so new to this White House, or had he conveyed those concerns to the president?
I'm not going to get into private conversations. I will say there have been intelligence assessments that have been out there that we have not walked away from. Certainly we leave that to our intelligence community to speak to, and that's an important part of what is put out from the federal government. What I've conveyed to you and what I'd reiterate is that the president made a decision because he felt that it was long past time to bring our troops home, and that there is not a military solution to the war in Afghanistan.
So, Ed, is it clear what U.S. support for Afghanistan will look like in the future?
Well, as she said a few times during the briefing today, Jen Psaki did, there will be some semblance of military support for Afghanistan if it's needed or as needed in the future. But this whole scale or wide use of the military in Afghanistan is effectively over. It could be over by the end of this weekend. They haven't officially said whether the withdrawal will be done by then. It's scheduled to be done by 9/11, 20 years since the terrorist attacks. But, as you saw there, and as you saw in some of the other answers she gave along similar lines on similar questions, as far as the White House is concerned, there may be the threat of civil war, but there is no longer seen to be an immediate threat to the United States, and therefore they don't believe that there should be a military option or response anymore in that country. And polling bears that out. There's bipartisan agreement on it. But obviously there's going to be concern, especially in the coming months, if the Taliban makes significant progress in getting to Kabul, in taking over more territory in that country, whether the United States and his allies need to reassess what they've just done. But for now, this president, as the last president did, sticking by the decision to get out.
Ed O'Keefe, Alayna Treene, and Courtney Subramanian, thanks to all of you for joining us. We appreciate it.